Welcome to the Dozy Historian YouTube channel. The air in Philadelphia was thick and hot, not just with the humidity of a midsummer July, but with the suffocating weight of an impossible decision. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, a brick edifice that would one day be known as Independence Hall, the men of the Continental Congress had, on the second day of the month, formally voted for separation. 2 days later, on the 4th of July, 1776, they adopted the final revised text. The document was a ledger of grievances, a philosophy of governance, and, above all, an irreversible act of treason against the mightiest empire on earth. When the last word was sanctioned, a profound silence descended, heavier than the summer heat. It was the sound of 56 men, merchants, planters, lawyers, signing their collective death warrant. Thomas Jefferson, the young Virginian whose pen had articulated the soaring phrases of liberty, knew the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," were not merely a political statement, but an alchemical formula, transforming subjects into citizens and a political dispute into a global revolution. They were no longer petitioning, they were proclaiming. The immediate aftermath was not marked by fanfare in Philadelphia, but by secrecy and immense crippling anxiety. The delegates understood the king's reaction would not be a mere verbal dismissal, but the unleashing of the full fury of the British military machine, already massing in the harbors of New York. The document, still wet with ink on a large sheet of parchment, was a thunderbolt, yet it was initially held close, its message disseminated cautiously. It was not until July 8th that Colonel John Nixon stood in the State House yard, squinting against the sunlight, and read the declaration aloud to a small, nervous crowd. As Nixon's voice carried the words, "These united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states," the symbolic weight of the act finally crashed over the city. A great spontaneous cheer erupted. Bells pealed from Christ Church and St. Peter's, ringing out not just a message of joy but a shrill alarm. It was a baptism of fire and sound. That night, King George III's coat of arms, prominently displayed outside the State House, was ceremoniously torn down and later burned in a celebratory bonfire. The people, who had been merely protesting the policies of Parliament, were now unequivocally at war with their king. The news spread rapidly, not by official proclamation, but by horseborne riders, the very arteries of the newly declared nation. Across dusty roads and through dense forests they carried printed copies, the famous broadsides to state legislatures, town squares, and crucially to the struggling Continental Army. In New York, the news arrived as General George Washington, his face etched with strain, wrestled with the grim reality of defending the city against a massive British force led by General William Howe. His troops were a ragtag collection, unpaid, underfed, and often prone to desertion. The general ordered the declaration read to every brigade. On July 9th, in the fading light of evening, the document was recited to the assembled regiments. For the soldiers, the 4th of July's echo was electrifying, a profound elevation of their purpose. They were no longer rebellious farmers fighting for a temporary repeal of taxes. They were the army of a new sovereign nation. Their sacrifice had been dignified by a principle. The next day, seized by a frenzied patriotic zeal, a group of soldiers and citizens rushed to Bowling Green, where a colossal gilded-lead statue of King George III sat astride a horse. They toppled the effigy, melting it down later to cast 42,000 musket balls, a perfect metaphor for the national transformation. The symbols of the monarchy literally forged into the instruments of its destruction. Yet, this revolutionary fervor was not universal. The Declaration did not unify America. It polarized it. For every joyous ringing of a bell, there was the tightening dread of a loyalist. The colonists became Americans in an instant, but that new identity came at the cost of civil war. In every colony, neighbor now eyed neighbor with suspicion, families fractured over the text's incendiary words. The Declaration was not just a document of external separation. It was a brutal agent of internal division. Thousands of loyalists, convinced the rebellion was doomed or morally wrong, began to flee their homes heading for Canada or back to Britain, abandoning property and profession for the sake of their king. For the Continental Congress, the Declaration was a calculated risk that became an immediate political necessity. The phrase, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, was aimed directly at European capitals. John Adams, one of the foremost architects of independence, knew that without a clear, formal break, no foreign power, especially not France, would risk war with Britain by supplying aid to a mere internal rebellion. The declaration, therefore, was a diplomatic plea, an essential prerequisite for securing the French alliance that would prove indispensable to their survival. The words themselves, particularly the majestic opening of the preamble, became the nation's spiritual charter. They were, however, a profound paradox. How could a nation founded on the self-evident truth that all men are created equal permit the brutal system of chattel slavery? Jefferson himself, a slaveholder, had included a powerful condemnation of the slave trade in his original draft, but it was excised by the Congress under pressure from Southern delegates. The moral contradiction of the Declaration lay nakedly exposed, an unhealed wound that would define the nation's conscience for generations to come. The promise of equality, while initially referring to the state's standing among other nations, was quickly seized upon by marginalized groups, women, free black Americans, and future abolitionists, as a promise of individual liberty and a standard against which the new republic would inevitably be judged. The immediate echo of the 4th of July, 1776, was thus a chaotic symphony, the defiant joy of the newly declared citizens, the anxious preparation of Washington's army, the bitter exodus of the Loyalists, and the cold, cynical calculation of European monarchs. The Declaration did not win the war. It defined it. It elevated a local uprising into a global conflict and burdened the fragile new republic with a moral commitment that it would spend the next 2 centuries struggling to fulfill. By putting pen to parchment, the men in Philadelphia had not simply ended one government. They had, with 3 simple, powerful sentences, declared the philosophical foundation for all governments that would follow. The work, however, had only just begun. The cannon shot of the Declaration had been fired, but the bloody battle for its defense, the true reckoning, was about to begin in the fields of New York. The news of the Declaration of Independence crossed the Atlantic, not on a swift frigate, but aboard a slow merchant ship, an irony lost on no one. When the broadsides finally reached London in August 1776, the initial reaction within the government of King George III was not panic, but a mixture of contempt, fury, and incredulity. The official severance, though long feared, was treated as the ultimate act of insolence by a rebellious faction of subjects, not the legitimate birth of a rival nation. To the king, the Congress were traitors, and their declaration was a masterpiece of absurdity. King George III, a man who took the maintenance of imperial authority as his sacred duty, saw the document not as a foundation for liberty, but as a direct personal affront. His political will had already hardened. The Declaration merely confirmed his resolve. He immediately dismissed the notion of negotiation or reconciliation. The time for olive branches was over. The rebellion would not be placated, it would be crushed. The British political establishment, led by Prime Minister Lord North, quickly mobilized their counter-response. Their political strategy was simple and two-pronged. Internally, solidify support at home by framing the war as a defense of the constitutional order. Externally, project an overwhelming display of military force to demoralize the Americans and attract European allies, or, at least, ensure their neutrality. The immediate military reaction was a staggering display of imperial power. Even as the Declaration was being read in New York, the British were executing the largest single mobilization of military force the world had yet seen. Under the command of General William Howe and his brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, a colossal fleet, over 400 ships carrying more than 32,000 professional soldiers, was already converging on the American coast. This was no mere punitive expedition. It was an attempt to subdue an entire continent. The scale of the force, a third larger than the population of Philadelphia itself, was intended to be an unanswerable argument. The sheer professionalism of this force contrasted starkly with Washington's ragtag Continental Army. The British soldiers were veterans, disciplined and equipped with the finest weapons and uniforms of the age. Crucially, the British also employed thousands of Hessian mercenaries, highly trained German troops contracted from various principalities, who added a layer of professionalism and, in the American imagination a frightening foreign brutality. The Americans viewed the use of foreign soldiers as further proof of the king's tyranny, a point the Declaration had already made. The campaign to crush the rebellion centered immediately on New York City. Geographically, New York was key. Its deep harbor could shelter the entire British fleet, and its position astride the Hudson River offered the strategic potential to divide the rebellious New England colonies from the rest of the continent. The Howe brothers, therefore, were tasked with capturing the city, annihilating Washington's army, and effectively decapitating the American military effort in one swift stroke. The ensuing battles for Long Island and Manhattan in late August and September 1776 were a brutal confirmation of British superiority. At the Battle of Long Island, August 27, 1776, the American army was outmaneuvered, outfought, and nearly destroyed. General Howe, a brilliant tactician, executed a masterful flanking maneuver that shattered Washington's lines, inflicting heavy casualties and capturing over 1,000 men. Washington, demonstrating a flash of the tenacity that would define his leadership, managed a miraculous, stealthy nighttime evacuation of his remaining troops across the East River from Brooklyn to Manhattan, shrouded by fog and darkness. The subsequent British campaign on Manhattan drove Washington steadily northward, resulting in a series of demoralizing American defeats at Kips Bay and Fort Washington. The soldiers of the Continental Army, many of whom had enlisted only for the summer, watched their ranks thin through injury, capture, and rampant desertion. Morale plummeted. The lofty ideals of the Declaration rang hollow in the ears of starving, freezing men retreating across New Jersey in the late autumn. The British political calculation accompanying this military push was that one decisive battle would prove the utter futility of the American cause. They believed that once Washington's army was destroyed, the civilian population, still reeling from the Declaration's suddenness and fearing the loss of property and life, would rush to submit and swear oaths of allegiance to the king. The Howe brothers even carried a peace commission, authorized by the king to offer pardons to all who would lay down their arms. This offer of pardon, however, demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the American mindset after the Declaration. Before July 4th, a pardon might have been acceptable. After it, a pardon meant a retraction of the foundational statement of national existence. To accept a pardon was to admit one was a traitor. Having proclaimed themselves free and independent states, the Continental Congress refused to engage with the Howe brothers, except as equals negotiating between sovereign powers. This steadfast political rejection stiffened the resolve of many wavering Americans. The British occupation of New York proved equally complex. While establishing a firm military foothold, the occupation forces faced the challenge of governing a populace that remained deeply divided. New York became a refuge for thousands of loyalists, who sought protection from the Patriots and were instrumental in aiding the British cause. The city transformed into a loyalist stronghold, a counter-capital to Philadelphia. Yet the occupying forces also fueled resentment through heavy-handed control and occasional abuses. The Lion's Roar had successfully achieved its immediate military objective, the capture of a vital city and the scattering of the American army. By December 1776, the Continental Army was reduced to a few thousand desperate men, their enlistments about to expire, facing a powerful, seemingly invincible foe. The British believed the rebellion was effectively over. London was already celebrating a de facto victory. Yet, this swift military success masked a critical strategic error. The British focused too heavily on territory and urban centers, rather than on the destruction of Washington's army and the extinguishment of the revolutionary government. Washington, despite his military losses, understood that the ultimate success of the Declaration rested not on holding cities, but on maintaining the army as a symbol of resistance and preserving the continuity of the Congress. It was this critical period of near collapse that forced Washington to make the most daring move of the war: the crossing of the Delaware River and the stunning, morale-boosting victories at Trenton and Princeton in late December 1776 and early January 1777. These victories, though small in scale, had a colossal symbolic impact. They proved that the British lion could bleed, that the American Declaration was still worth fighting for, and that the campaign to crush the rebellion would be a long, drawn-out war, not a swift, punitive action. The political response from London remained unyielding. The war was popular among the British elite and much of the public, who were told the Americans were led by tyrannical rebels seeking to escape their fair share of imperial costs. The British Parliament authorized more funds, more men, and more ships. They doubled down on the idea that overwhelming force would eventually prevail. In the end, the lion's roar, while terrifying and devastating, failed to intimidate the Americans into submission. The Declaration of Independence had fundamentally changed the stakes. By demanding unconditional acknowledgement of our independence, the Congress ensured that the only acceptable British response was utter military victory, a victory the Howe brothers, for all their strength, failed to deliver. The campaign of 1776, meant to extinguish the new nation, merely forged the resolve needed for the long, painful struggle ahead. Following the thundering Declaration of Independence and the devastating counterpunch of the British war machine, the Continental Congress and General George Washington faced their most immediate and existential crisis: how to sustain a professional army from a population profoundly distrustful of centralized military authority. The Declaration had created a nation in principle, but to defend it they needed soldiers, not just volunteers, but a unified, disciplined fighting force. This was the era of the call to arms, a desperate, chaotic effort that highlighted the raw spirit of liberty and the acute scarcity of unity among the nascent American states. The bedrock of American defense lay in the colonial militia system. Rooted in English common law and colonial necessity, the militia was composed of able-bodied men expected to provide their own arms and serve locally, often only for a few weeks or months to repel immediate threats. Their strength lay in their local knowledge and fierce devotion to their homes. Their weakness was a crippling lack of discipline, an aversion to long-term service, and a fundamental unwillingness to fight far from their own soil. Washington, a Virginia planter and a veteran of the French and Indian War, understood that militias alone could not defeat the highly trained British and Hessian regulars. He required a Continental Army, a standing force that owed allegiance to the Congress, not just to a single state. His vision was ambitious, a military establishment capable of operating strategically across the continent. His reality, however, was a perpetual scramble. Recruitment was a relentless, heartbreaking struggle. The Continental Army relied on short-term enlistments, often for only 1 year, which meant that as soon as a soldier became trained and battle-hardened, his term of service expired, and he often went home to plant, harvest, or simply escape the brutal conditions. The devastating defeats in New York in the late summer and fall of 1776, immediately following the euphoria of the Declaration, severely dampened patriotic fervor. As the army retreated across New Jersey, Washington wrote despairingly of the spirit of desertion and the inability to rely on them a moment longer than they are kept in the field. To attract recruits, the Congress was forced to use not just the lofty language of liberty, but material incentives. They offered bounties of land, clothing, and small sums of cash, a clear indication that idealism alone was insufficient to sustain the war effort. This reliance on mercenaries, a term Washington himself used for those motivated only by money, clashed awkwardly with the revolutionary rhetoric of selfless patriotism. The scarcity of supplies was a constant, debilitating foe. The new nation possessed almost no domestic manufacturing capacity. Muskets, gunpowder, flints, cannons, and uniforms, the sinews of war, had to be purchased abroad, often smuggled through the British naval blockade at exorbitant prices. The quartermaster department, perpetually underfunded and disorganized, struggled to move what little they had. The soldiers, the self-proclaimed defenders of liberty, often marched barefoot, wrapped in blankets instead of coats, and subsisted on meager rations. The suffering was most acute during the winter encampments, particularly at Valley Forge, 1777-1778. Though this occurred later in the war, the genesis of the supply problem was in 1776, the inability of the 13 states to act as a unified body. Each state retained a fierce sovereignty, often prioritizing its own militias' needs over those of the Continental Army. Wagons of flour, destined for Washington's hungry troops, might be stopped at a state border because The local authorities decided their own troops or citizens needed them more. This fractured system, built on the weak structure of the Articles of Confederation, was the principal enemy of the soldiers' survival. The most profound challenge was the scarcity of unity. The Declaration had been signed by men from 13 distinct political entities, and the Army reflected this deep-seated regionalism. New Englanders, largely Puritan and quick to organize, looked down on the Southern riflemen as undisciplined ruffians. Virginians and Pennsylvanians regarded the Yankees as overly frugal and argumentative. Washington himself, a Southerner, had to constantly navigate this minefield of prejudices and competing loyalties. The formation of the Army was less a merging of forces and more a fragile confederation of regional battalions. The sheer difficulty of funding the war compounded every other problem. The Congress had no power to levy national taxes. It could only request funds from the individual states, which were often slow or simply refused to comply. To pay for the war, the Congress resorted to printing massive amounts of continental currency, paper money not backed by gold or silver. The result was rapid, devastating inflation. Soldiers were paid in currency that quickly became worthless, a cruel irony for men fighting to protect their property rights. This financial instability further undermined morale and fueled the cycle of short enlistments and desertion. Washington, in his letters to Congress, became increasingly desperate, urging the delegates to take action. The reflection upon the fate of these men, who have been struggling with a complication of hardships, is truly melancholy. No pecuniary recompense can compensate for the hardships they have endured. The transformation of the American soldier was a slow, painful process. Men who came in as idealistic farmers and mechanics were forged into soldiers not by the power of Congress, but by the shared crucible of hardship and the sheer force of Washington's leadership. The general understood that he was not just commanding an army. He was forging a national identity. He enforced strict discipline, not merely for tactical reasons, but to instill a sense of common purpose and professional pride that transcended state lines. The shared misery and the common enemy became the true binders of the Continental Army. In this chaotic environment, the figure of the citizen soldier emerged as the central heroic figure of the revolution. He was a paradox, a man fighting a war to ensure his right to return home, but who was forced to endure a lengthy absence and brutal conditions. His commitment was conditional, yet his endurance was legendary. The story of the revolution is not only the story of Washington and the generals, but of the thousands of anonymous men, the summer soldiers and sunshine patriots scorned by Thomas Paine, alongside the dedicated few, who through grit, cold, and hunger, transformed a collection of squabbling militias into the armed backbone of a nascent republic. The call to arms was answered haphazardly, sustained precariously, and unified only by the threat of extinction. It was the hardest labor of the Declaration, proving that the philosophical commitment to liberty was meaningless without the practical, messy, and profoundly difficult work of building an army capable of defending it. Beyond rhetoric, the immediate cost of liberty. The pen had declared independence. The bells had pealed the news, and the initial wave of patriotic fervor had crested and broken. Now came the brutal, unromantic necessity of paying for it. The immediate aftermath of the Declaration was defined by the transition from lofty rhetoric to a harsh physical cost, a price tallied in spilled blood, lost property, and crippling fear. This chapter details the grim realities faced by the soldiers and the civilian populations as the war moved from a distant possibility to a terrifying, immediate presence. The first major accounting of this cost came in the fields and forests surrounding New York City in the late summer of 1776. The British, executing the campaign detailed earlier, aimed for a single decisive blow. Washington, determined to hold the city despite his better judgment, positioned his fledgling army in and around Brooklyn Heights on Long Island. The price paid by the soldier to my boy, Battle of Long Island, August 27, 1776, was the first large-scale engagement of the war, and it delivered a shocking lesson in military reality to the American troops. The citizen soldiers, brave but undisciplined and led by inexperienced officers, were no match for the professional training and tactical genius of General Howe's forces. The American defeat was absolute and demoralizing. Troops were shattered, routed, and captured in droves. For the soldiers, the immediate cost was horrific. Casualties, Hundreds were killed and over 1,000 captured. The losses instantly decimated the most experienced units. The shock of combat. Many had never witnessed large-scale warfare. The disciplined volleys of the British redcoats, the terrifying charge of the Hessian bayonets, and the deafening roar of cannon fire were a brutal awakening. Men who had volunteered with idealistic notions of militias easily repelling tyranny were confronted with the terrifying efficiency of a professional killing machine. Loss of morale. The defeat fostered an immediate crisis of confidence. Retreating troops felt betrayed by their officers and abandoned by fortune. The grand promises of the declaration felt distant and irrelevant when faced with the daily reality of freezing, starving, and fighting a superior enemy. The famous near-miraculous retreat across the East River on the night of August 29-30, engineered by Washington, saved the Army but not its spirit. What followed was a humiliating retreat across New Jersey. Washington's army dwindled from over 20,000 to barely 3,000 by December 1776. Soldiers walked with torn shoes, leaving bloody tracks in the snow, tormented by hunger and the gnawing fear that they were fighting a lost cause. The reality of being a Continental soldier was defined by scarcity. Scarcity of food, scarcity of blankets, scarcity of reliable pay, and ultimately scarcity of hope. The immediate cost of liberty for the man in the ranks was his health, his property, neglected at home, and often his life. This grim endurance, epitomized later by Valley Forge, began in the disastrous summer of 1776. The trauma inflicted on civilians, the war did not confine itself to the battlefield. It consumed the civilian landscape, imposing a terrifying and volatile cost on the non-combatant population. The arrival of an army, whether American or British, meant disruption, requisition, and fear. Forced requisitions and economic ruin. Armies, being massive consumers of food, livestock, and supplies, simply took what they needed. The civilian population, particularly in the mid-Atlantic states of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York, became the supply chain. Farmers saw their winter stores confiscated, their horses and cattle seized, and their wagons commandeered, often with only worthless Continental paper currency as compensation. This immediate economic cost bankrupted countless families. The horror of occupation. Where the British and Hessians occupied territory, the trauma was particularly acute. New York City, a key port, remained under British control for the entirety of the war. Its citizens lived under military law, subjected to searches, curfews, and the constant presence of foreign soldiers. Stories of looting, property damage, and occasionally, violence against civilians spread like wildfire, used effectively by patriot propagandists to stiffen resistance. The Loyalists' reckoning. The Declaration demanded a choice, and those who remained loyal to the Crown also paid a heavy price. Patriots viewed Loyalists as internal enemies and traitors. They faced harassment, confiscation of property, and often violent intimidation. Tarring and feathering was a common, humiliating punishment. When the British Army retreated, thousands of Loyalists fled their homes, becoming refugees who lost everything for the sake of their allegiance. The war was fundamentally a civil war, and the immediate cost was the fracture of communities and families, smallpox and disease. One of the greatest, yet often overlooked, costs of the war was disease. Smallpox devastated both military and civilian populations. Armies living in close quarters with poor sanitation became breeding grounds for contagion. The disease killed far more soldiers than musket balls ever did, further crippling the ability of Washington's army to fight. The general was forced to take the radical step of ordering the inoculation of the entire Continental Army, a risky and controversial move that eventually saved thousands of lives, but the immediate cost in human suffering was immense. The erosion of the ideal, the grim realities of 1776-1777, stripped away the initial romantic veneer of the revolution. The cost of liberty went beyond rhetoric into the realm of national identity and political survival. Political fissure. The defeat forced the Continental Congress to confront its own limitations. The delegates, often quarreling and indecisive, struggled to raise funds, coordinate supplies, and maintain public support. The cost here was the erosion of belief in the central government. It became clear that the Articles of Confederation, drafted out of fear of central tyranny, were inadequate for winning a war. The rise of sacrifice as virtue. With idealism failing and money worthless, a new national virtue had to be forged: sacrifice. Washington, through his tireless letters and personal example of unflinching resolve, elevated the suffering of the common soldier into a national epic. The cold, the hunger, and the retreat were recast not as failures, but as the trials necessary to earn the unalienable rights promised by the Declaration. A crueler, longer war. The immediate cost of the initial defeats ensured that the war would not be the swift, glorious uprising many had hoped for. It was cemented as a long, brutal war of attrition, demanding a deep and sustained commitment from a population that was already weary. In the first year after the Declaration, the American people learned that liberty was not a gift of parchment, but a commodity purchased at the highest possible price. The cost was a starving, freezing army, a ravaged countryside, and a society fractured by civil strife. The immediate cost was the near collapse of the revolutionary cause, which made the subsequent turnarounds at Trenton and Princeton all the more miraculous. The echo of the 4th of July was replaced by the grim sound of the winter wind rattling the tents of the few who remained to continue the fight. Philadelphia's shadow. The Continental Congress in exile, the city of Philadelphia, the intellectual heart of the Revolution and the birthplace of the Declaration, was meant to be the sturdy, permanent capital of the new United States. Yet in the face of the relentless British campaign, it became a symbol of the young nation's fragility. The challenges faced by the Continental Congress went beyond rhetoric and battlefield tactics. They were the existential tests of governance under fire. This is the story of Philadelphia's shadow, the period when the revolutionary government was forced into a humiliating exile, grappling with internal dissent and the profound difficulties of managing a war without true executive authority. The summer of 1777 brought with it the chilling realization that General William Howe, having failed to definitively crush Washington and New Jersey, was now maneuvering his massive British army toward Philadelphia itself. The move was a brilliant psychological and political stroke. Capturing the seat of the rebel government would be a profound propaganda victory, symbolizing the collapse of the new republic. As Howe's forces advanced through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, the atmosphere in the State House, where the Declaration had been signed just over a year earlier, turned from anxious deliberation to panicked dissolution. The delegates of the Continental Congress, the 50-odd men who had defiantly signed their names to the Declaration, were now faced with the terrifying reality of British capture and certain execution as traitors. On September 18, 1777, with the British vanguard only hours away, the Congress dissolved its session and fled the city. The ignominious flight from the capital was a moment of deep humiliation. What followed was an odyssey of temporary residency and instability. First a hasty retreat to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and then, finding that location too vulnerable, a move across the Susquehanna River to York. Pennsylvania. York became the reluctant, temporary capital of the United States. This period of exile cast a long, demoralizing shadow over the fledgling government. The challenge was immense. How to project authority and confidence to the army and the populace when the very seat of that authority was constantly on the run. The challenges of governance in exile in York. Far from the established infrastructure of Philadelphia, the challenges facing the Congress were magnified, diminished legitimacy. The very act of flight made the government appear weak, disorganized, and fearful. It was difficult to demand sacrifice from citizens and soldiers when the leaders themselves were seeking safety. Paralyzing internal tensions. The Congress was not a cohesive body, but a collection of delegates representing 13 separate, often rivalrous, sovereign states. The pressure of war and the failures of the army intensified these internal political tensions. Factions emerged, clashing over military strategy, financing, and the overall distribution of power. The perils of the Articles of Confederation. The Congress was attempting to govern a war with a debilitating political structure. The Articles of Confederation, which were being debated and finally adopted during this period of exile, created a national government that was essentially powerless. It had no power to levy taxes, it could only beg for funds from the states. No power to raise a national army, it relied on the states to fill quotas. No true executive branch, it was governed by committees. This structural weakness was the primary reason for the Army's chronic underfunding and the resulting scarcity of supplies. The Conway Cabal, a crisis of command, the military failures of 1776-1777, culminating in the loss of Philadelphia, bred a dangerous atmosphere of doubt about George Washington's leadership. The victory at Saratoga in October 1777, achieved by General Horatio Gates while Washington was losing the capital, fueled the fires of dissent. This led to the Conway Cabal, a secretive political maneuver involving disgruntled generals like Thomas Conway and certain delegates in Congress who sought to discredit Washington and replace him with the more popular Gates. The crisis was a devastating distraction, forcing Washington to dedicate valuable time and energy to defending his command from his own political masters. The cabal was not merely a personality clash. It represented a deep-seated philosophical divide. Some in Congress feared Washington's growing popularity and power, viewing a strong general as a potential threat to Republican liberty, a New World Caesar. Washington's survival was a victory for the principle of a unified military command under civilian control. But the political infighting highlighted the near-fatal scarcity of unity, even at the highest level of government. Securing the diplomatic lifeline, despite the turmoil, the Congress in exile did manage to achieve one crucial, war-altering success, securing the French alliance. Meeting in York, they ratified the Treaty of Alliance with France in 1778. The loss of Philadelphia had, ironically, spurred the European powers to action. The British had won the city, but their failure to crush Washington's army and the stunning American victory at Saratoga convinced the French that the American cause was viable and worth supporting. This alliance was the only reason the fragile government survived. French money, military expertise, and most importantly, naval power provided the resources that the Congress, due to its own structural weaknesses, could not supply. The return to Philadelphia in the summer of 1778, after the British evacuated the city to concentrate their forces in New York, was a muted, weary homecoming. The State House was scarred by British use and neglect, a physical metaphor for the damage inflicted upon the nation's political structure. The period of Philadelphia's shadow was essential to the Revolution. It was during this time that the delegates learned, through bitter experience, the true cost of a weak central government. The near collapse of the army, the shame of flight, and the threat of internal political sabotage proved that independence required more than a declaration. It required a capable, unified, and enduring structure of governance. The challenges of their exile laid the groundwork for the eventual understanding, 10 years later, that the Articles of Confederation were a failure and that a new, stronger constitution would be necessary to truly realize the promise of the Declaration of Independence. Diplomacy's gambit. Franklin's mission to the court of Versailles. The Declaration of Independence was the birth certificate of the United States. The French alliance was its life support. The ink on the parchment had barely dried before the Continental Congress understood a harsh truth. Military might alone could not secure their freedom. The vast superiority of the British Navy and the depth of the Crown's treasury meant that, without foreign intervention, the American cause was doomed to be a short, bloody rebellion. The key to survival lay not in the fields of New York, but in the gilded halls of Versailles. In the autumn of 1776, even as Washington's army was being systematically beaten back from New York, the Congress dispatched a 3-man commission to France. It was arguably the most critical diplomatic mission in American history. Heading the commission was Dr. Benjamin Franklin, the polymath, philosopher, and scientist who was already the most famous American in Europe. Joining him were Silas Deane, an astute but controversial politician, and Arthur Lee, a sharp-tongued, mistrustful Virginian whose incessant paranoia would nearly sabotage the entire enterprise. Franklin's arrival in France was less a political event and more a cultural phenomenon. He did not arrive as a stuffy formal diplomat, but as the living embodiment of the Enlightenment ideal. He consciously cultivated the image of the rustic, virtuous American. He eschewed the powdered wigs and silks of European court fashion, instead wearing a simple brown suit and the famous slightly eccentric fur cap. This image, the wise philosopher-statesman uncorrupted by European decadence, captivated the French imagination. He became an instant sensation, his image decorating snuff boxes and medallions. He was not merely a diplomat. He was a fashion icon and a symbol of liberty. Franklin understood that he was negotiating with a monarchy, but selling a revolution. His genius lay in appealing not just to the court's geopolitical calculations, but to the French intellectual class. The philosophes, the thinkers and writers of the Enlightenment, saw the American Revolution as the practical fulfillment of their own ideals of natural rights and self-governance. By securing their admiration, Franklin ensured powerful pressure was placed on King Louis XVI's foreign minister. Comte de Vergennes, a shrewd and cautious diplomat, was the central figure in the negotiations. His motivations were rooted not in sympathy for the American cause, but in French realpolitik. France had been soundly defeated by Great Britain in the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, 2 decades earlier, losing vast territories in North America and suffering a devastating blow to its national pride. Vergennes viewed the American revolt as a golden opportunity to weaken Britain permanently, redress the balance of power, and regain international prestige. Yet Vergennes was wary. Officially recognizing the American rebels meant an immediate declaration of war on Great Britain, a risk he could not take lightly. He needed assurance that the Americans were serious, committed, and most importantly, had a chance of winning. The news arriving from America in late 1776 was dismal. The defeats in New York made the American cause look increasingly hopeless. In the early stages, therefore, France's support was covert. Through a dummy corporation, Rodrigue Hortalez and Carreur, managed by the brilliant playwright-turned-financier Pierre Beaumarchais, the French and Spanish monarchies secretly funneled vast amounts of aid to the American rebels. This included gunpowder, muskets, uniforms, cannons, and crucially, French military expertise. Without these hidden shipments, Washington's army would have starved of supplies in 1777. Franklin's task was to transition this secret aid into open alliance. The negotiations were protracted and often frustrating. Arthur Lee, convinced that Dean and even Franklin were profiting from the secret arms deals, sent back highly critical and paranoid dispatches to Congress, sowing discord. Franklin remained imperturbable, utilizing his immense personal charm to maintain access and influence at court. He was patient, understanding that he was playing a long game against the background of fluctuating military news. The critical turning point came in October 1777 with the stunning American victory at the Battle of Saratoga. This was the definitive proof Vergennes needed. The defeat and capture of an entire British army under General Burgoyne demonstrated that the Americans were not just rebels to be easily suppressed. They were capable of achieving major military victories and sustaining a protracted war. Franklin capitalized instantly on the news. The victory eliminated Vergennes' primary fear, that he would enter the war only to watch the Americans surrender shortly thereafter, leaving France to face Britain alone. On February 6, 1778, the treaties were signed. The signing of the Treaty of Amity and Commerce formally recognized the United States as a sovereign nation, and the Treaty of Alliance pledged that if France entered the war, neither France nor the U.S. would conclude a truce or peace with Great Britain without the formal consent of the other, effectively guaranteeing American independence. The news of the alliance was a seismic shock to Europe and America. In France, the treaties were celebrated with open parades and official recognition of the American delegation. For the American army at Valley Forge, suffering through a brutal winter, the news was a massive boost to morale and a guarantee that their suffering had not been in vain. For Great Britain, the French entry was a strategic disaster. The war instantly transformed from a colonial revolt into a global conflict. Britain's overwhelming naval superiority in the American waters was now challenged by the French fleet, forcing the British to disperse their resources to defend possessions in the West Indies, India, and the home islands. The British war machine, focused entirely on the North American colonies, was forced onto a defensive footing across the entire globe. Franklin's success at Versailles, built on his reputation, his understanding of French culture, and his flawless timing after Saratoga, remains a diplomatic masterpiece. It secured the essential funds, supplies, and most importantly, the French military and naval support. support that would prove decisive years later at the final victory at Yorktown. The Declaration had provided the philosophy, but Franklin's diplomacy's gambit provided the means of survival. Hearts divided, loyalists, spies, and the Civil War within. The Declaration of Independence had proclaimed the 13 colonies united against a foreign crown. But this bold assertion masked a perilous underlying truth. The Revolution was not merely a war for independence. It was a devastating civil war within. The ideological chasm that opened in 1776 cleaved communities, shattered families, and pitted neighbor against neighbor, creating a landscape of suspicion and violence where the enemy was often indistinguishable from a friend. The immediate cost of liberty was the brutal realization that America's heart was divided, a fertile ground for internal dissent and the shadowy, high-stakes game of espionage, the three faces of America: patriot, loyalist, and neutral. When the colonies took up arms, the population was roughly split into three factions. The patriots, the minority that demanded independence, were vocal, organized, and ruthless in their pursuit of the revolutionary cause. They controlled the new state governments and the Continental Congress, using their institutional power to enforce conformity. The Loyalists, or Tories, constituted perhaps 1/5 of the white population, a significant and often influential group who remained steadfastly dedicated to King George III and the constitutional order of the British Empire. Between these two militant poles lay a vast, often silent neutral majority, people who wished only for the return of peace and security, desperately trying to avoid commitment and the inevitable reprisals that followed. The Loyalists were not a monolithic group of aristocrats. They were diverse, encompassing wealthy merchants who feared economic ruin, frontier settlers who relied on the crown for protection against Native American tribes, Anglican clergy who cherished their ties to the Church of England, and thousands of ordinary farmers and tradesmen who simply believed that a constitutional monarchy was the best guarantor of ordered liberty. Their allegiance was often based on deep-seated principle, not merely self-interest, and they saw the patriots not as liberators but as anarchic, rebellious tyrants. The patriot response to this dissent was swift and often brutal. In the atmosphere of wartime paranoia, neutrality was deemed disloyalty. Local patriot committees, committees of safety, inspection, and correspondence sprang up across the states, acting as revolutionary vigilantes. They enforced boycotts, demanded oaths of allegiance, and administered justice that bypassed traditional courts. Those who refused the oath or expressed loyalist sentiments faced social persecution, economic pressure, and often outright violence. Loyalists were subjected to tarring and feathering, public humiliation, and imprisonment. Their property, homes, land, and businesses, was frequently confiscated by the state governments under the guise of funding the war effort. Thousands of prominent Loyalists, including the revered governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, were driven from their homes and forced into exile, seeking refuge in British-held New York, Canada, or Britain itself. This forced expulsion of a significant political minority was a dark and necessary measure for the Patriots, effectively purging the body politic of committed opposition and seizing vital resources. The internal war, blood feuds, and guerrilla conflict in regions where patriot and loyalist populations were more evenly matched. The ideological struggle devolved into a low-grade, vicious guerrilla warfare that raged far from the major battlefields. This was the true civil war within, a conflict characterized by ambushes, midnight raids, and personal score settling. Nowhere was this conflict more brutal than in the southern backcountry, particularly in the Carolinas. Here the war was less about grand principles and more about blood feuds, regional rivalries, and control over resources. Loyalist militias, often comprised of Scots-Irish settlers, fought patriot partisan bands, such as those led by Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, with savage intensity. At the Battle of Kings Mountain, 1780, the entire engagement was fought not between the British and the Continentals, but between Loyalist and Patriot militias. The result was a devastating, total victory for the Patriots, who showed little mercy to the surrendered Loyalists. This level of violence, often committed without the oversight of professional officers, left scars on the region that would endure for generations. The Mohawk Valley of New York saw a similarly vicious conflict, where Loyalist forces under figures like John Butler, often allied with powerful Iroquois Confederacy tribes, clashed continuously with Patriot settlements. These frontier conflicts involved massacres, the destruction of crops, and the targeting of civilians, making it clear that no place in the new nation was safe from the revolution's internecine fury. The deep divisions among the populace fundamentally destabilized the military effort, forcing Washington to divert precious resources and troops to subdue internal threats rather than focus solely on the British main force. The Shadow War, spies and the network of treason. Presence of deep internal divisions made the new republic profoundly vulnerable to espionage. The war became a secret war of code-breaking, infiltration, and double agents where information was as valuable as gold, and a single piece of intelligence could save or destroy an army. The British, with the vast network of loyalists at their disposal, were initially masters of intelligence. Loyalists served as guides, couriers, and infiltrators, providing General Howe with crucial information on troop movements and supply lines. The very geography of the colonies, with its fluid boundaries and numerous ports, made securing secrets almost impossible for the Patriots. In response, George Washington and his head of intelligence, Major Benjamin Tallmadge, were forced to create an entirely new, sophisticated, and ruthlessly efficient spy network. The most famous of these was the Culper Ring, based primarily in New York City, the heart of the British occupation. The Culper Ring was a marvel of covert communication. It consisted of a tightly knit group of Patriot civilians, including Robert Townsend, alias Culper Jr., a seemingly innocuous merchant, and Abraham Woodhull, Culper Sr., a Long Island farmer who risked instant execution to relay messages. Their system involved invisible ink, using a chemical compound developed by John Jay, which allowed seemingly blank pages to reveal hidden messages when treated with heat. Code names and dead drops. Identities were concealed using code names, and messages were left in concealed locations, dead drops like a wooden box in a farm field, avoiding direct contact between agents. The secrecy of women. Crucially, the ring utilized women like Agent 355, whose true identity remains one of the great mysteries of the Revolution, to carry intelligence. Women often moved more freely through British lines, less likely to be suspected of being couriers, turning their domestic roles into a powerful military asset. This network provided Washington with vital warnings, including the first intelligence about a British counterfeit currency scheme, designed to flood the American economy with worthless paper, and most spectacularly, information that saved the French fleet from a British ambush. The dangers of this shadow war were starkly illustrated by the fate of Nathan Hale. Hale, a young, idealistic Continental Army officer, was dispatched on a mission to gather intelligence behind British lines in New York in September 1776. Unskilled and compromised, he was captured with incriminating papers on his person and summarily executed by the British without a trial. His legendary final words, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country," became a powerful piece of patriot rhetoric, yet his fate served as a chilling warning of the ultimate cost of espionage. The greatest threat of all was not an unknown foreign spy, but an American hero turning traitor. The most famous instance of treason was the defection of Benedict Arnold. A brilliant but resentful general, Arnold betrayed the Patriot cause in 1780 by attempting to hand over the crucial American fortress at West Point to the British. Arnold's motivations were complex. A perceived lack of appreciation and financial hardship drove him to treason. His plot's narrow exposure, through the capture of British Major John Andre, Arnold's contact, sent a shockwave through the country. It proved that the rot of disloyalty could reach the highest levels of the Continental Command. The survival of the revolution hinged on the exposure of this plot, an event that demonstrated the knife edge upon which the new republic was balanced. The chapter of Hearts Divided confirms that the Declaration was not a magical unifying document. It was a catalyst for a painful, protracted, and often ugly internal conflict. The deep divisions among Americans, the existence of loyalists, the necessity of brutal internal policing, and the constant threat of sophisticated espionage and high treason were the grim background to the glorious fight for independence. The revolution was won not just on the battlefield, but in the shadows where trust was a luxury and the cost of liberty was often the betrayal of a neighbor or the life of a spy. An unalienable paradox, slavery and the promise of freedom, the most profound, searing contradiction at the heart of the American Revolution, lay within the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This soaring rhetoric of freedom was composed by Thomas Jefferson, a man who personally owned over 200 human beings. The founding of the United States was, therefore, an unalienable paradox, a fight for liberty and self-governance conducted by men who simultaneously maintained and defended the institution of chattel slavery. The very act of rebellion against the British Crown was fueled by a fear of political slavery, the loss of rights and self-determination imposed by Parliament. Yet, this intense preoccupation with their own freedom existed alongside the daily reality of millions of enslaved Africans and African Americans who possessed no rights, no property, and no liberty. This profound hypocrisy was not a sideline issue. It was structurally integral to the wealth, politics, and social order of the Southern colonies, and its existence cast a crippling moral shadow over the entire revolutionary enterprise. The omission, the scars on the Declaration. Jefferson was acutely aware of the moral discrepancy, and in his original draft of the Declaration, he included a powerful clause that condemned King George III for perpetuating the slave trade, calling it a cruel war against human nature. This clause, however, was excised by the Continental Congress. The decision to remove it was a calculated political sacrifice made for the sake of unity. Southern delegates, particularly those from South Carolina and Georgia, whose economies were utterly dependent on slave labor, refused to sign a document that threatened their system. Northern delegates, many of whom profited directly or indirectly from the trade, were also unwilling to press the issue. The resulting declaration was a victory for political expediency over moral principle. By omitting the clause, the founders secured the vital unity necessary to fight the war, but they consciously postponed the reckoning over slavery. They left the inherent paradox that liberty for some required the continued bondage of others as a destructive, ticking time bomb at the foundation of the new republic. The revolution as an opportunity for the enslaved population. The revolution was not just a political event. It was a profound, life-altering opportunity for literal freedom. They keenly observed the rhetoric of the patriots and turned the language of the Declaration against their masters. If all men were created equal, why not them? This realization led to a military and political dynamic that terrified the slaveholding class, the armed agency of the enslaved. Lord Dunmore's Proclamation, 1775. Lord Dunmore, the Royal Governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation offering freedom to any enslaved person belonging to a patriot master who would leave to fight for the British Army. This move was the single most successful emancipation act of the entire war. Thousands of enslaved people, recognizing the British as a path to immediate liberty, fled their plantations. They became black loyalists, serving as soldiers, laborers, and spies for the Crown, transforming the war from a rebellion into a war of liberation for African Americans. The Black Loyalists' contribution. The British employed these freedmen in critical roles, creating regiments like the Black Pioneers who performed essential military tasks. Their participation forced the Patriots to confront the fact that they were losing valuable resources and facing armed former slaves, whose motivation for fighting was arguably purer than that of many white patriots. The Patriots' reluctant shift, initially hesitant to arm black men, fearing they would turn their weapons against their oppressors, the sheer necessity of filling ranks forced the Patriots to grudgingly reverse course. Most northern states and Maryland allowed free and enslaved black men to enlist, often offering freedom in exchange for service. Integrated units. While the Continental Army was segregated by race in some respects, many units, especially those from New England, were the most integrated forces the nation would see until the Korean War. Black soldiers fought with distinction at major battles like Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. This unit, largely composed of black soldiers, many of whom were promised freedom by their masters in exchange for serving, became famous for its bravery, particularly at the Battle of Rhode Island in 1778, where they successfully repelled 3 Hessian assaults. The sight of armed black men fighting for the American cause was a profound, symbolic counterpoint to the British policy, allowing the Patriots to claim, however imperfectly, that they too valued the contribution of enslaved people to the cause of liberty. The presence of these soldiers created a powerful, undeniable argument for future emancipation. Legal and philosophical challenges. The paradox generated significant legal and philosophical challenges in the immediate post-war period. The Somerset Decision, 1772. Even before the war, a British court ruling held that chattel slavery was incompatible with the laws of England. This ruling, while not directly applying to the colonies, terrified Southern planters and was cited by many historians as a major factor pushing the planter elite toward independence. They wanted to secure their property, their slaves, from potential British legal interference. Thus, the pursuit of political liberty for the Patriots was, for many, inextricably linked to the preservation of human bondage. The first steps toward abolition. The Declaration's powerful rhetoric had an immediate, tangible effect in the North. Inspired by the language of equality, states like Vermont, 1777, Pennsylvania, 1780, and Massachusetts, 1783, through judicial decision, passed gradual or immediate abolition acts. While the North was not free of racism, or even entirely of slavery, these acts marked the decisive beginning of a regional divergence on the issue that would eventually lead to the Civil War. These states, in their own charters and bills of rights, adopted the Declaration's principles and attempted to live up to its promise. The unalienable paradox was not resolved by the Revolution. It was merely enshrined and institutionalized. The war made the principles of liberty universal and undeniable, but the founders' failure to apply them universally to all men guaranteed that the new republic would be born with a fatal flaw. The ultimate cost of this paradox was deferred, but it was immense. A moral debt that could only be paid in the blood of the next generation. The enslaved people who fought for either side, the thousands of black loyalists who evacuated with the British, and the black patriots who won their freedom through continental service, were the living embodiment of the Declaration's greatest promise and its deepest shame. They were the first to truly test the unalienable nature of rights, forcing a nation founded on hypocrisy to eventually reconcile its ideals with its reality. The groundwork for the great moral struggle of the 19th century was laid the moment the words, "All men are created equal," were etched onto the same parchment that protected the right to hold slaves. The frontier under fire. Conflict with native nations in a shifting landscape. While the Continental Army and the British regulars clashed for control of coastal cities and political capitals, the American Revolution expanded inexorably into a brutal, multi-sided conflict on the continent's western edge. This was the frontier under fire, a vast, volatile territory stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, where the War of Independence quickly became a war of territorial conquest. For the hundreds of distinct native nations who called this land home, the Declaration of Independence and the ensuing conflict represented not a fight for liberty, but a catastrophic shifting landscape that threatened their sovereignty, their land, and their very existence. The core of the conflict lay in the Patriots' expansionist desire. The colonies had long resented the Proclamation Line of 1763, a British decree that forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachians to prevent conflict with native tribes. For the revolutionaries, gaining free and open access to the western lands was a major unspoken motivation for independence. The Declaration explicitly lists among its grievances that King George III had endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. This dehumanizing language set the tone for the campaign to come. The strategic choice, allies and enemies for the native nations. The choice of alliance was agonizingly complex. They were not monolithic. Each tribe and confederacy faced unique pressures and calculated their alignment based on which power, the British or the Patriots, posed the lesser long-term threat to their land. The British offered what seemed to be the most reliable bargain. They promised to restrain colonial expansion, honored previous treaties, and possessed the established network of forts and the wealth to supply guns, ammunition, and goods. Thus, the vast majority of the powerful tribes sided with the Crown, the Iroquois Confederacy, 6 nations. Most of this powerful group, especially the Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, and Onondaga, allied with the British, viewing the Americans as the immediate aggressors constantly encroaching on their territory in New York. The Shawnee and Delaware. These groups in the Ohio Valley saw the Patriot militias as existential threats to their hunting grounds, and thus relied on British support at Detroit and other western forts. The Cherokee and Creek. In the southern interior, these nations used the British presence in Florida and along the coast to resist the land claims of the expanding southern states like Virginia and North Carolina. The Patriots, offering only vague promises of future coexistence and often demanding immediate land cessions, struggled to win over major allies. Their few successes included some parts of the Tuscarora and Oneida tribes of the Iroquois, who recognized that the growing power of the American settlers made accommodation the only path to survival. The war of retaliation and ruin in the north, in the northern frontier. The war became a cycle of devastating retaliation. The Iroquois, led by figures like the brilliant Mohawk leader Joseph Brant, Thayendanegea, waged a highly effective war against Patriot settlements in the Mohawk Valley in Pennsylvania. Their raids were swift, brutal, and aimed at destroying the settlers' capacity to sustain themselves, earning the fierce hatred of the colonists. The Patriot response was equally relentless. In 1779, Washington, determined to neutralize the Iroquois threat and secure the western flank for settlement, ordered the Sullivan Expedition. General John Sullivan was given explicit instructions. The immediate object is the total destruction and devastation of their settlements. The expedition was a campaign of environmental ruin, a deliberate strategy to destroy the basis of the Iroquois' survival. Sullivan's forces marched through the heartland of the 6 nations, systematically burning 40 villages, destroying an estimated 160,000 bushels of corn, and cutting down vast orchards and crop fields. The devastating effect was immediate. The Iroquois, deprived of their winter food supply and shelter, were forced to retreat toward the sanctuary of British forts, becoming refugees dependent on British charity. The Sullivan Expedition fundamentally and permanently broke the military and political power of the Iroquois Confederacy, opening up millions of acres of fertile land for post-war American settlement. This campaign, far from the battlefields of the Coastal War, was a ruthless victory of colonial expansion dressed as military necessity. The Southern and Western campaigns, in the South and the Ohio Valley, the conflict was equally destructive. Kentucky and the Ohio Valley, George Rogers Clark, leading a small force of Virginia militia, executed daring raids against British outposts like Kaskaskia and Vincennes. Clark's primary goal, however, was not simply to fight the British but to intimidate the Ohio tribes and secure Virginia's claim to the vast lands of the Northwest Territory. His actions established an American military presence that would be instrumental in post-war treaty negotiations. The Cherokee War, responding to relentless encroachment by settlers from North Carolina and Virginia. The Cherokee launched attacks on frontier forts in 1776. The southern states retaliated with overwhelming force, sending militias that burned nearly 50 Cherokee towns and forced the cession of huge tracts of land in subsequent treaties extracted under duress that foreshadowed the fate of countless other tribes. The immediate cost of liberty on the frontier was paid primarily by the native populations. The war for them was a catastrophe regardless of who won. If the British won, they would still face the inevitable tide of land-hungry settlers. If the Patriots won, they would face an organized, victorious government whose foundational principle was the belief that the Western lands were their birthright. The legacy, the seeds of future conflict, the shifting landscape irrevocably changed the map of North America. The native nations, already weakened by disease and previous wars, were now devastated by the destruction of their resources and the refugee crisis caused by the Revolutionary War. The ultimate tragedy was realized in the Treaty of Paris, 1783. In negotiating peace, Great Britain ceded all land east of the Mississippi River to the United States without consulting any of its native allies. For the native nations who had fought and bled for the crown, this was the ultimate betrayal. They had been treated as mere pawns, their sovereignty disregarded, their homelands arbitrarily transferred to their greatest enemy. For the new United States, the defeat of the native nations was viewed as a necessary precursor to achieving true national identity. The land acquired in the West, won by the sword and formalized by the treaty, became the engine of the early republic's growth, the vast resource that fueled the vision of an expansive, agrarian democracy. The frontier under fire served as a bloody counter-narrative to the preamble of the Declaration. It showed that the unalienable rights of the new nation's citizens were often predicated on the alienation of rights and the displacement of those who had occupied the land for millennia. The revolution secured the independence of the colonists, but for the native nations it was the beginning of a relentless, two-century struggle for cultural and territorial survival against a nation fueled by the very ideals it was conceived to deny them. The cost was the definitive transformation of the American landscape from a contested borderland into the firm territory of the United States. Turning the tide, the strategic shift and key victories, the years 1776 and 1777, had been a relentless series of defeats for the Continental Army, culminating in the humiliating loss of Philadelphia and the bitter endurance of the army at Valley Forge. The rhetoric of the Declaration, so grand and inspiring, seemed incapable of stopping the powerful British war machine. The very survival of the American experiment depended on a pivotal moment, a strategic shift that could transform the military equation and secure the foreign allies necessary to win. That moment arrived not as a single battle, but as a critical, multifaceted change in momentum that truly began the process of turning the tide. The pivot point, Trenton and Princeton, winter 1776-1777. The first, and perhaps most vital turning point was a psychological one, delivered in the darkest days of the war. By December 1776, Washington's army was a wreck, beaten, starving, freezing, and reduced to a mere 3,000 men whose enlistments were set to expire on January 1st. The British believed the rebellion was effectively over. Washington knew that without an immediate, dramatic victory, the Declaration would become a forgotten, discredited piece of treasonous paper. This desperation fueled the strategic shift from defense and retreat to audacious offense. On the night of Christmas Day, 1776, Washington made his legendary move. He ordered his men across the ice-choked Delaware River, navigating a perilous 9-hour crossing in a blinding sleet storm. The next morning, the American forces executed a flawless surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. The victory was swift and overwhelming. The Americans captured nearly 1,000 professional German soldiers without losing a single man in the fighting. This was immediately followed by another brilliant maneuver. After confronting the British forces sent to retaliate, Washington slipped away under the cover of night, marching his weary troops around the enemy flank. He struck the British garrison at Princeton on January 3, 1777, securing another crucial victory and forcing the British to retreat back to New Brunswick. The impact of Trenton and Princeton was not measured in territory gained, but in renewed morale and political legitimacy. These two small victories saved the army. They convinced thousands of soldiers to re-enlist, saving the Continental Army from immediate dissolution. Restored confidence. They proved that American citizen soldiers, under skilled command, could defeat professional European regulars, bolstered Congress. They restored a measure of confidence in the Continental Congress, which had fled Philadelphia, and demonstrated to the world that the commitment to the Declaration was real. This was the first key victory that prevented the British from crushing the Revolution in its infancy. The decisive stroke. The Campaign of Saratoga, 1777. While Washington fought a strategic war of attrition in the mid-Atlantic, the decisive military event that truly changed the global momentum of the war occurred in the forests of upstate New York. The British, operating on a rigid and ill-coordinated plan, sought to divide the colonies by having General John Burgoyne march south from Canada, aiming to link up with forces coming north from New York City. Burgoyne's campaign was marked by arrogance and logistical failure. He was hampered by slow progress, long supply lines, and aggressive harassment from American militias. The crucial moments came in the autumn of 1777 at Saratoga, the Battle of Freeman's Farm, September 19th. American forces, including riflemen led by Daniel Morgan, inflicted heavy casualties on the British, stalling their advance. The Battle of Bemis Heights, October 7th. A fierce American assault, led controversially and brilliantly by Benedict Arnold, prior to his treason, broke the British lines, surrounded, cut off from supplies, and facing an overwhelming force of Continentals and militia, led by General Horatio Gates. Burgoyne was forced to surrender his entire army on October 17, 1777. Saratoga was the true global turning point of the war. First total surrender. It was the first time a massive, seasoned British army had ever completely surrendered, shocking the military establishments of Europe, securing the French alliance. For months, Benjamin Franklin had been subtly negotiating in Paris, trying to convince the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, that the American cause was viable. Saratoga provided the irrefutable military proof that the Americans could win. France, Britain's ancient enemy, formally recognized American independence and signed the Treaties of Alliance and Amity in February 1778. This formal alliance was the most critical strategic shift of the entire war. The American Revolution was instantly transformed from an internal British colonial rebellion into a global war involving the world's major naval powers. The French provided the crucial elements the Americans desperately lacked: a powerful navy, professional troops, large loans, and a seemingly limitless supply of war materials. The Southern strategy and the final gambit. After the failure of the Northern campaign, the British adopted a Southern strategy, believing that a large population of loyalists in the Carolinas and Georgia would rise to support the crown. This move, however, led to a different kind of war, a brutal, protracted civil war of attrition and guerrilla combat, as explored in the Hearts Divided chapter. This Southern campaign set the stage for the final, key victory that cemented the tide change, Yorktown, 1781. Following an exhaustive campaign through the South, the British commander, Lord Charles Cornwallis, retreated to the coastal town of Yorktown, Virginia, to await resupply and evacuation by the Royal Navy. Washington immediately recognized the opportunity. Working in seamless coordination with his French allies, he executed a strategic masterstroke, the French naval blockade. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed from the West Indies and decisively defeated the British fleet at the Battle of the Chesapeake, or the Battle of the Capes, securing control of the sea. This was the pivotal moment, ensuring Cornwallis could not be rescued or resupplied by the Royal Navy. The Franco-American March, Washington, with a joint army of Continental and French troops under the command of the Comte de Rochambeau, executed a brilliant rapid march from New York to Virginia, effectively trapping Cornwallis by land. The siege of Yorktown lasted 3 weeks. With no hope of naval relief and facing a relentless Franco-American bombardment, Cornwallis was forced to surrender his entire army on October 19, 1781. Though smaller British garrisons remained in New York and Charleston, Yorktown was the crushing blow. When Lord North, the British Prime Minister, received the news, he reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over." Yorktown was the military climax of the Revolution, a victory made possible only by the strategic shift of the French alliance. It proved that combined European and American efforts could defeat the British Army in the field and the Royal Navy at sea. The cost of pursuing the war, now expanded globally to include French, Spanish, and Dutch conflicts, was simply too high for the British Parliament to bear. The turning of the tide began with the daring stroke at Trenton, was politically confirmed by the victory at Saratoga and the French alliance, and was militarily concluded at Yorktown. These key victories transformed the struggle from a desperate colonial rebellion into a successful war for independence, finally securing the reality of the self-evident truths declared on that hot July day in Philadelphia. The war, while continuing for 2 more years of negotiation, had been won. The final siege, convergence at Yorktown, and the end of the fighting, the war. After 6 long years of grinding attrition, Psychological lows and diplomatic maneuvering hurtled toward its dramatic, conclusive climax on the muddy, low-lying peninsula of Yorktown, Virginia. The final siege was not merely a battle. It was a masterwork of military and naval coordination, a triumphant convergence of American land tenacity and French strategic might. This single overwhelming event provided the definitive military answer to the question posed by the Declaration of Independence and marked the true, dramatic end of the fighting for American sovereignty. The trap is set. Cornwallis's retreat, following the British failure to crush the rebellion in the north. Their focus had shifted to a southern strategy. Lord Charles Cornwallis, a capable and aggressive British commander, had achieved major victories, but these came at a high cost, drawing him into an exhaustive and debilitating pursuit of the American forces through the Carolinas. By the summer of 1781, Cornwallis, weary of the partisan warfare and seeking to resupply and consolidate his forces, marched his army north into Virginia. Upon arriving in Virginia, Cornwallis followed orders to establish a fortified naval base that could maintain British control over the Chesapeake Bay. He chose the small tobacco port of Yorktown, situated on a narrow peninsula between the York and James rivers. It was a defensible position, but critically it was also easily isolated. Cornwallis, confident in the superiority of the Royal Navy, believed that if pressed he could always be rescued or evacuated by sea. This decision, to dig in on a vulnerable peninsula, provided the perfect opportunity for the Allied Franco-American forces, creating the precise conditions for the final siege. The strategic convergence, a race against time. The Allied commanders, General George Washington and the French commander-in-chief, the Comte de Rochambeau, were camped near New York, feigning an attack on the main British stronghold there. Secretly, however, they had been communicating with the French naval commander, Admiral François de Grasse, who was sailing north from the West Indies with the powerful French fleet. The plan hinged on two near-impossible elements of convergence. The naval coup. De Grasse was to sail his entire fleet into the Chesapeake Bay, thereby denying the British Army access to its only escape route, the Swift March. Washington and Rochambeau had to execute a rapid, covert march of over 400 miles from New York to Virginia without alerting the British. The strategy was executed with flawless precision. In late August 1781, Washington and Rochambeau led their combined army of 7,000 French and American troops in a lightning march south. To maintain secrecy, they employed deception, leaving a small contingent to continue signaling in New York while the main force raced south. The Battle of the Chesapeake, securing the water. The decisive factor in the final siege was not fought on land, but on the water. While Washington's army was marching south, Admiral de Grasse arrived in the Chesapeake Bay. On September 5, 1781, the French fleet met the British relief fleet, led by Admiral Thomas Graves, in the crucial Battle of the Chesapeake, or the Battle of the Capes. The naval engagement was not a massacre, but a strategic French victory. The British suffered greater damage, and critically, Graves made the decision to retreat his damaged ships to New York for repairs. The victory had an immediate, profound consequence. Admiral de Grasse secured permanent control of the Chesapeake Bay. This was the ultimate strategic shift. Cornwallis was now completely cut off. The promise of rescue, which had underpinned his decision to fortify Yorktown, was gone. The noose around the British Army had been cast by the Royal Navy's ancient enemy. The siege begins, September-October 1781. By late September, the convergence was complete. The ground forces, Washington's Continentals, the Virginia militia, and the French Expeditionary Force arrived at Yorktown, totaling approximately 17,000 troops, vastly outnumbering Cornwallis's 8,000 men. The siege began with the standard procedure of 18th century warfare, digging parallel trenches toward the enemy fortifications. First parallel. On the night of October 6th, the Allied forces dug the first parallel trench, a massive undertaking performed in silence and darkness, putting them within 800 yards of the British lines. Second parallel and redoubts. The decisive moment came when the Allies needed to establish the second parallel, placing their heavy artillery within devastating range of the main British defenses. This required capturing two small but heavily fortified British outposts known as Redoubt No. 9 and Redoubt No. 10. On the night of October 14th, two separate assault teams were deployed. The French, under the Baron de Viomenil, successfully stormed Redoubt No. 9. Simultaneously, the Americans, led by Alexander Hamilton in a stunning display of courage, charged Redoubt No. 10 with fixed bayonets, strictly ordered not to stop and reload their muskets. They quickly overran the position. The capture of these redoubts allowed the Allies to move their most powerful siege guns directly into the second parallel. The subsequent bombardment was crushing. Continental and French artillery rained continuous fire onto the British positions, destroying their remaining defenses and turning the town into an inferno. Cornwallis's position became untenable. The end of the fighting desperate, Cornwallis attempted one final, desperate measure: a nighttime evacuation across the York River to Gloucester Point on the opposite side of the peninsula. However, a sudden violent storm scattered the small boats, forcing the general to abandon the attempt. With his defenses crumbling, his supplies exhausted, and his men decimated by casualties and disease, Lord Cornwallis realized the battle was lost. At 9 a.m. on October 17, 1781, 4 years to the day after the British surrender at Saratoga, a drummer boy beating a parley and a British officer waving a white flag appeared atop the British works. The terms of surrender were harsh, reflecting the bitterness of the Civil War. Washington, remembering that the British had refused to grant the American surrender terms the honors of war at Charleston, 1780, insisted on a similar humiliating protocol. On October 19, 1781, the surrender ceremony commenced. Claiming illness, Cornwallis refused to attend, sending his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, in his place. O'Hara attempted to surrender his sword to the French General Rochambeau, reflecting the British view that the French were the more honorable enemy. Rochambeau pointedly deferred to Washington, who in turn instructed his second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, to accept the sword from the defeated British. As the British troops marched out to lay down their arms between the two triumphant lines of French and American soldiers, a British band famously played the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." The military campaign had reached its dramatic, definitive conclusion. Though the Treaty of Paris would not be signed for another 2 years, and skirmishes would continue, Yorktown was the end of the fighting for practical purposes. The final siege, executed through combined Franco-American genius, had convinced the British Parliament and King George III that the American rebellion could not be militarily defeated. The political will to continue the bloodshed and expense of a global war was gone. The victory confirmed the reality of the declaration. The United States was, in fact, indeed free and independent. The American experiment had been saved. Negotiating sovereignty, the Treaty of Paris and world recognition, the surrender at Yorktown in 1781, marked the end of the fighting, but not the end of the war. The military victory had secured a seat at the table, but the true prize, sovereignty, had yet to be formally secured by ink and parchment. The final chapter of the revolution was fought not with muskets and cannons, but with wit, patience, and cunning diplomacy in the salons of Europe. This is the story of negotiating sovereignty, the delicate, protracted process that culminated in the Treaty of Paris and the ultimate, binding world recognition of the United States. The American Commission, a team of contrasts. The Continental Congress appointed a small, yet brilliant commission to handle the peace negotiations in Paris. Benjamin Franklin, the elder statesman, revered across Europe for his scientific genius and amiable wit. Franklin was the key figure in establishing the crucial French alliance and brought an unmatched level of international legitimacy to the American cause. John Adams, the passionate, pragmatic, and often abrasive lawyer from Massachusetts. Adams was deeply distrustful of French motives and rigidly focused on securing fisheries and specific territorial boundaries. John Jay, the cautious, sophisticated, and multilingual New York lawyer. Jay was the most acutely aware of European power politics and played the decisive role in forging the final diplomatic strategy. These men, often at odds with each other's temperament and political priorities, were tasked with achieving an objective that seemed impossible: convincing the world's greatest empire to formally acknowledge the nation born from a radical declaration. The complex web of European interests. The negotiations were not a simple bilateral discussion between Britain and America. They were entangled in a complex web of European interests, which made the process a diplomatic minefield. France, Vergennes, America's primary ally, but one with its own strategic goals. France wanted to weaken Britain, but not to allow the United States to become too powerful. French Foreign Minister, the Comte de Vergennes, favored limiting American expansion to the Appalachian Mountains, thereby keeping the fledgling nation reliant on France and creating a powerful Spanish buffer state to the west. Spain, America's other ally. Spain was allied with France and possessed a vested interest in the Floridas and the territory west of the Mississippi. Spain cared little for American independence and actively sought to limit American access to the Mississippi River, threatening the economic future of the Western territories. Great Britain, Shelburne. The British, now under the more conciliatory Prime Minister Lord Shelburne, recognized the need for peace to stem the massive costs of the global war. Shelburne's strategy was to win the Americans away from the French alliance by offering surprisingly generous territorial terms, hoping to ensure a future commercial relationship with the new nation. The strategic breakthrough, Jay's independence. The American Commission faced a grave dilemma. They had been explicitly instructed by Congress to do nothing without the prior consent and approval of their French allies. However, John Jay, recognizing the French and Spanish efforts to strategically limit American borders, grew profoundly suspicious. He believed Vergennes was secretly negotiating with Britain to divide the western lands among European powers. Jay took the bold, audacious step of initiating secret direct negotiations with the British without informing the French. He convinced Adams and eventually Franklin that their survival depended on breaking the chain of French dependency. This was a massive political risk, an act that violated their instructions and risked alienating their only major ally. But it proved to be the pivotal moment of the negotiations. Lord Shelburne, seeing the opportunity to sow discord between America and France, responded enthusiastically to Jay's independent overtures. The British made a crucial concession. They agreed to recognize American independence as a precondition for the talks, not a point to be negotiated later. This formal acceptance of sovereignty immediately elevated the American delegation from rebellious agents to legitimate representatives of a nation. Defining sovereignty, the American triumph in territory, with the British eager to secure a quick peace and the Americans now negotiating outside the constraints of their French alliance. The resulting treaty was, militarily and politically, a stunning triumph for the United States. The Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783, defined American sovereignty through 4 key provisions: full recognition of independence. Great Britain formally acknowledged the United States of America as free, sovereign, and independent states, ending all claims to the former colonies. This was the ultimate validation of the Declaration of Independence's generous boundaries. The Americans secured an astonishingly large territory. The new nation's borders were set from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River in the west, and from the Great Lakes in the north to the northern border of Spanish Florida in the south. This vast land acquisition, more than doubling the size of the original colonies, far exceeded what any European power, including France, had intended fishing rights. John Adams secured the vital right for Americans to fish off the coast of Newfoundland, protecting the economic interests of New England, repayment of debts and loyalist compensation, the compromise. To satisfy the British, the Americans agreed that the Congress would earnestly recommend to the state legislatures that they compensate loyalists for confiscated property and honor all pre-war debts owed to British merchants. This was largely an unenforceable recommendation, but it provided the necessary political face-saving measure for the British government. The aftermath, world recognition and unresolved issues. The signing of the Treaty of Paris sent shockwaves through Europe. World recognition had been achieved, validating the American experiment and its revolutionary principles. France's reaction. Vergennes was initially furious at the American commissioner's duplicity, but Franklin cleverly diffused the situation. smoothing over the alliance and reminding the French that Britain had been the primary aggressor in the war. France had achieved its central goal, the humbling of Great Britain, the problem of the West. While the treaty defined the borders, it did not secure the land. The British refused to evacuate their forts in the Ohio Valley until America repaid the pre-war debts, and the Spanish still controlled the lower Mississippi River, posing immediate military and economic challenges to the new nation. Furthermore, the treaty completely ignored the native nations who inhabited these lands, setting the stage for decades of brutal frontier conflict, the birth of a nation. For the first time, the United States existed not just as a philosophical concept or a fighting force, but as a legally recognized entity on the global stage. The sovereignty gained was immediate, but the work of building a unified, effective government capable of maintaining those borders and repaying its debts remained the final, most daunting challenge. The Treaty of Paris was the legal document that transformed the self-declared freedom of 1776 into recognized international fact. It secured not just independence but a continental scale, guaranteeing that the United States would be a world power. Yet the price of that victory was a weak central government, a massive debt, and a host of unresolved international and internal conflicts that would push the nation to the brink of collapse, setting the stage for the need for a total reformation of its governing structure. A question of union. The fragility of the Articles of Confederation with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The external threat was defeated, and world recognition was secured. The grand dream of the Declaration of Independence had been realized. Political freedom was won. However, the immediate post-war period revealed a severe and potentially fatal internal crisis. The question of union loomed large, centering on the profound fragility of the Articles of Confederation, the first attempt to establish a national government for the newly independent states. The central irony was that the very fear of tyranny that had fueled the revolution now threatened to undo its success. The fear of central authority, the men who framed the Articles of Confederation, which were drafted starting in 1776 and finally ratified by all states in 1781, were deeply influenced by Enlightenment philosophy and their recent, painful experience under British rule. They viewed a strong, centralized government, particularly one with a powerful executive or the ability to levy taxes, as the primary source of despotism. Their solution was to create a firm league of friendship among the states, effectively making the states sovereign and leaving the national government deliberately weak. The Articles created a national legislature, the Continental Congress, but severely limited its powers. The design was a conscious rejection of the British system, leading to a structure so decentralized that it struggled to perform the most basic functions of a national government. The crippling weaknesses of the Articles. Fragility of the Articles was apparent in every facet of national life, immediately jeopardizing the hard-won independence. Financial paralysis. The Congress possessed no power to tax. It could only request or requisition money from the states. The states, always prioritizing their own needs and often indebted themselves, routinely ignored these requests. Consequently, the national treasury was chronically empty. This lack of funds meant inability to pay the debt. The United States owed enormous sums to its own soldiers, who faced years of unpaid wages, domestic suppliers, and foreign creditors, especially France and Dutch bankers. The inability to pay these debts destroyed the nation's credit rating and international standing. Worthless currency. Without gold or silver to back it, and with no national authority to enforce its value, the continental currency issued during the war became virtually worthless. Hence the popular phrase, "not worth a continental." Lack of enforcement power. The Congress could pass laws, but it had no executive branch to enforce them, and no national judiciary to interpret them. The states could simply choose to ignore national mandates, leading to legal chaos and a complete breakdown of compliance. Unanimity for amendments. Any change or amendment to the Articles required unanimous consent from all 13 states. This impossible standard effectively froze the document, preventing any necessary reforms even when the economic and political crises became existential. No power to regulate commerce. The lack of a national authority to regulate trade. allowed the states to impose tariffs and taxes on goods moving across state lines, turning the League of Friendship into an economic rivalry. States treated each other like foreign nations, crippling interstate commerce and fostering deep resentment. Internal conflicts and state sovereignty. The political landscape under the Articles was dominated by a bitter struggle over state sovereignty. States that had fiercely defended their autonomy against Britain were equally determined to retain it against the Congress. Boundary disputes. Without a strong central arbiter, states engaged in open disputes over Western land claims, threatening military conflict between neighbors like Pennsylvania and Connecticut. The problem of Western lands, the issue of how to govern the vast, newly acquired territory west of the Appalachians, almost tore the Union apart. States with no Western claims, like Maryland, refused to ratify the Articles until land-rich states like Virginia ceded their claims to the national government. The eventual cession was a major victory for national unity, but highlighted the tension between state and national interests, creating order in the West. Despite their paralysis, the Congress under the Articles did manage one lasting achievement: the Northwest Ordinances, 1785 and 1787. These acts established a systematic Republican process for admitting new states on an equal footing with the original 13, and, critically, banned slavery from the Northwest Territory. This set a profound precedent for orderly expansion and laid the groundwork for future national unity. But it was a single success in a sea of failures. Shays's rebellion, the crisis of the Republic, the economic hardship, fueled by the Congress's inability to stabilize the currency and pay its debts, led to the most direct and terrifying challenge to the question of union. Shays's Rebellion, 1786-1787. In western Massachusetts, hundreds of poor farmers, many of whom were veterans of the Revolution whose back wages had never been paid, were facing foreclosure and imprisonment for debt. Led by Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army captain, they rose in armed revolt, shutting down courthouses to prevent debt proceedings. The fragility of the national government was immediately exposed. Congress's impotence. The Congress had no national army to put down the rebellion. It could only request troops from the states, which responded slowly and reluctantly. Private funding. The rebellion was ultimately put down not by the national government, but by a privately funded militia raised by wealthy merchants in Boston. To many national leaders, particularly George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, Shays's rebellion was the terrifying proof that the government of the Articles was incapable of maintaining internal order, the most fundamental purpose of any state. The inability to protect private property and suppress domestic insurrection made the United States appear ungovernable, casting doubt on the entire revolutionary experiment. The necessity of change by 1787, the combination of economic chaos, border disputes, international humiliation, and violent domestic insurrection forced the conviction among leading Americans that the Articles of Confederation were a tragic failure. The victory of independence was slipping through their fingers, not from the external force of the British Crown, but from the internal weakness they had so meticulously built into their own system. The question of union was no longer philosophical, it was existential. The delegates recognized that to save the Declaration's promise of liberty and the pursuit of happiness, they had to confront their fear of strong government and create a truly national framework. The failure of the Articles served as the indispensable, brutal education that paved the way for the Constitutional Convention, the final bold step in realizing the unfinished dawn of the American Republic. The lesson was clear. A union born of weakness could not survive the challenges of peace. The unfinished dawn, America's reckoning after the Declaration, hard-won peace laying the cornerstone for a new republic. The year is 1787. 14 years have passed since the first shots were fired at Lexington, and 11 since the Declaration of Independence was signed. The fighting has long ceased. The Treaty of Paris has been ratified, and the hard-won peace is a tangible, though deeply unsettled, reality. The United States of America is a nation in possession of vast lands, immense potential, and a terrifying fragility. This concluding chapter is a reflection on the arduous path to independence and how the crucible of war and the failures of the post-war government finally set the stage for the creation of the Constitution, laying the cornerstone for a new republic and shaping the future of the continent. Reflection on the arduous path. The journey from hopeful rebellion to recognized sovereignty was paved with sacrifice. The victory was a testament to the collective endurance of a diverse people. The sacrifice of the soldier. The revolution was paid for by the Continental Army, the citizen soldiers who endured the starvation of Valley Forge, the humiliation of retreat, and the constant threat of death, all while facing a professional enemy. Their commitment was not to a king or a flag, but to the abstract ideals articulated in the Declaration. Their reward, unpaid wages and worthless currency, served as the most tragic indictment of the government they had risked their lives to protect. The burden on the civilian. The war ravaged the countryside, displacing populations, destroying farms, and plunging the nation into economic despair. The immediate cost of liberty was measured in the deep division of families, patriot versus loyalist, and the staggering national debt. The unresolved paradox. The greatest burden carried into the peace was the unalienable paradox of slavery. The rhetoric of all men are created equal had spurred northern emancipation, yet it simultaneously entrenched the institution in the South. The peace treaty secured freedom for the states but failed to secure the freedom of millions of its inhabitants, guaranteeing a future reckoning of conscience and blood. The price paid by others. The land that defined the new republic's boundaries, granted so generously in the Treaty of Paris, was paid for by the catastrophic displacement and destruction of the native nations, who were excluded from the peace process entirely. Their sovereignty was stripped away, turning the American victory into their ultimate defeat. The revolution was a success, but it was an incomplete success. It had achieved separation from Great Britain, but it had not yet achieved a functional, unified nation capable of fulfilling the promise of its founding principles. The looming shadow of anarchy. The peace itself proved almost as dangerous as the war. The fragility of the Articles of Confederation was now manifest in every sphere. Economic collapse. States, freed from imperial rule, immediately began to act in their own self-interest, erecting trade barriers, printing their own currencies, and ignoring national debt obligations. The nation's credit stood in ruins, crippling its ability to conduct foreign policy or domestic commerce. International contempt. Great Britain, sensing the weakness, refused to evacuate its lucrative frontier forts, arguing that the United States had failed to uphold its treaty obligations regarding loyalist compensation and debt repayment. Spain, controlling the mouth of the Mississippi, arbitrarily denied Western settlers access to the vital river for trade. Without a central government capable of raising an army or enforcing treaties, the U.S. was powerless to defend its own borders or interests. Domestic insurrection. Shays's rebellion was the final terrifying alarm. It was a clear signal that the experiment in extreme decentralized liberty had failed. The farmers, veterans of the revolution, were fighting their own government. A government too weak to protect property, ensure justice, or maintain order. The fear among the intellectual and propertied class was palpable. Anarchy, the ultimate destroyer of republicanism, was at the door. Laying the cornerstone, the road to Philadelphia, 1787, the realization that the nation was teetering on the brink of dissolution spurred the leaders of the revolution into a final, revolutionary act. Figures like George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, disillusioned by the political and economic chaos, argued fiercely that the Union could not survive unless the Articles were completely discarded. The Annapolis Convention, 1786, a small gathering called to discuss commercial disputes, led directly to the call for a full-scale convention to revise the Articles. The stage was set for the pivotal gathering in the very city that had given birth to the Declaration. In the sweltering summer of 1787, 55 delegates gathered in the Pennsylvania State House, the same room where independence had been declared. The challenge was immense: to create a powerful, energetic government capable of action, while simultaneously establishing ironclad checks and balances to prevent the tyranny they had fought so hard to escape. They had to strike a balance between liberty and order, between local sovereignty and national unity. The debates were furious, often threatening to collapse the convention entirely. They had to solve the very problems the articles had been designed to avoid, creating a true executive. The solution was a president, elected indirectly, who would be strong enough to enforce laws and lead the nation, but subject to impeachment and limited terms. The power of the purse. The Congress was granted the power to tax and regulate interstate and foreign commerce, thereby solving the financial crisis that had plagued the war and the peace. A national judiciary. A Supreme Court was established to interpret national law and resolve disputes between the states, securing the rule of law. The Great Compromise. The delegates resolved the crippling tension between large and small states by creating a bicameral legislature, the House of Representatives, based on population, and the Senate, equal representation per state. The unfinished work of the cornerstone, the resulting Constitution of the United States, was the pragmatic, political answer to the failures of the Articles. It was a document focused on structure, power, and stability. It was the cornerstone, the strong foundational stone necessary to hold the entire structure of the Republic. However, the Constitution did not resolve the moral contradictions of the Declaration. It merely managed them. The delegates, prioritizing stability and union over immediate moral justice, agreed to the infamous 3/5 compromise, counting enslaved persons as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of both taxation and representation, and agreed to protect the African slave trade for another 20 years. They had secured a stronger government, but they had done so by embedding the unalienable paradox deeper into the national framework. The hard-won peace was thus defined by this final, profound duality. The Americans had secured their right to self-governance through blood and treaty, and they had created a durable framework to protect that right. But in doing so, they left the central philosophical promise of the Declaration, that all men are created equal, as an unfinished dawn. The Constitution was the necessary engineering marvel that saved the Union, but it also deferred the ultimate moral reckoning, ensuring that the future of the United States would be a continuous struggle to reconcile its powerful ideals with its painful realities. The cornerstone was laid, and upon it would be built the future of the American dream, imperfect yet resilient, ready to face the long, complicated history that lay ahead.